Previously, I shared the making of this bow, showing few details of the process. Today, I'll get a bit more in-depth on the making of one that's quite similar, even sharing my errors in judgment. I'll be showing my process as an example, not as the best or only way to work. I'm going to start by reducing the belly of this hickory stave with a draw knife. The goal here is merely to reduce the bulk of the wood. Wood coming directly from a tree has its imperfections to work around. For instance, in places like this, you need to exercise caution as you approach the final thickness. That way you don't remove more wood than intended. However, I still have a long way to go. Next, I'll need to peel or shave the bark. Even small splits like this can be problematic if not given appropriate attention. And in fact, this may have been a contributor to an issue I encounter later on. For now, let's move on to bark removal. With well-dried wood like this, the best way for me is prying up and peeling with a chisel. Then I follow that by scraping with a draw knife. I'll work in this fashion until the bark is gone and most of the cambium is removed. Here's a small scrap piece where I can show you what to avoid. Trees grow in layers called growth rings. Violating or cutting through these rings reduces the wood's strength under tension. So the best option is to leave one ring along the entire back of the bow, especially when you aren't adding a sinew or other type of backing. Here, I'm intentionally violating multiple growth rings. I'll highlight the layers or the rings here so you can see them better. All I've done is cut deeper into the wood near the corner of the stave, and in doing so, exposed multiple rings. This can be corrected by taking the whole back down to the lowest exposed ring. Laying out your design in precise detail isn't always necessary, but since I'm trying to copy my previous bow in most aspects, I'm measuring everything out this time. With the profile laid out, I'll work down to it using a couple of different tools. Depending on the side of the draw knife used and the angle at which you hold it, you'll find it easily removes more or less material. I'm going to carefully work from both directions in the narrower handle section so as not to split off part of the limb. As I close in on my profile lines, I like to use a farrier's rasp or spoke shave. The rasp is great, but it leaves a rough finish, so if I find that the wood grain isn't fighting me all that much, I typically use a spoke shave. Then I'll return to the back again to clean up this thin cambium, and I'm just using a paint scraper. If you encounter knots, like this one in my previous bow, leave them intact. Follow the growth ring over the knot, don't cut through it. You also may notice the old bow has a significant crown, meaning it's rounded on the back, while the new stave is relatively flat. The new one came from a larger diameter tree, so this is just inherent to the wood. A stave will have naturally weaker and stronger points, so although thickness doesn't always equate to strength, you'll initially want to keep a consistent thickness tapering from the handle to the limb tips. Along the back of most bows, you'll find natural undulations. You'll want to parallel these on the belly. I like to make pencil mark notes for myself where to remove and keep material. I often work from the handle outward, but if my blade is tearing or chattering, or I need to avoid a particular spot, I'll work the other way as well. You might find that keeping your tool, especially spoke shaves, at a slight angle to the workpiece provides a smoother cutting experience. I can tell by looking at them that my limbs will probably bend a little bit now, so it's time to start floor tillering. This allows me to quickly check whether I'm getting an even elliptical bend through both limbs before I'm ready for a string or tillering tree. Skipping ahead a bit, I'm going to cut my string nocks in, and I do not recommend copying these angles. They're too steep, and I was being unnecessarily fancy. I did it on my first bow, but the wood on that bow was unflawed, so cut them closer to square, that's all I'm getting at. Or use a different style altogether. This first string is just a tillering string of 550 paracord, and the tree just a notched board. I'm remarking my handle section so I can clean up the profile a bit. That tool I'm using there is called a sureform. It's a bit like a cheese grater. Aside from truing up the handle with it, I'm also breaking all my sharp edges. Along with sanding the bows back to prep for Sinew application. I chose to use elk leg tendons, which I first pounded with a wooden mallet to separate from their exterior, then proceeded to peel into appropriate sized strands. I'll be putting a total of 3 layers on my bow, and for me it worked out to roughly 9 tendons. But that will vary based on tendon size, bow size, and method of application. I like to clean off all the tufts and papery bits from my strands to help with tidier application later. Once I've reduced my strands to size, I sort them into bundles by length and place those bundles between magazine pages. Now I'll clean the back of my bow with alcohol to remove debris and oil. For my adhesive, I like Titebond 3, but Titebond 2 or equivalent wood glues would also work. Titebond 3 is exceptionally waterproof with next to no chance of moisture-induced failure in inclement weather. Ironically enough, we do need to thin it slightly with water for use with Sinew. You want to mix it to a thick drizzle consistency, then paint it onto the bow's back and allow it to dry. Then you can start applying Sinew. First, I take a bundle and saturate it with water to make it supple. I then wring out the excess water, followed by saturating in the glue mixture. As I squeegee out the excess glue, I ensure that my strands are parallel so they'll lay flat along the back of the bow. Having finished one layer, you can move directly to the next. However, I didn't have time that night, and Sinew applies just as well to a dry layer as a wet one, so I start the next day in the same fashion as before, apart from sizing with a glue brush, which is only necessary over the wood to keep it from soaking all the glue out of the Sinew. You probably noticed this on the first layer, but it's best to apply the bundles as if they are bricks in a wall. This way, there is no weak breaking point where all your ends line up. Now, if you know or have read anything about this process, you're probably aware that there are as many opinions and misconceptions about Sinew drying as there are about drying wood. So I'll tell you as simple and honest as can be. Using the proper method, it's 2 weeks or less to safe working moisture content. In my opinion, taking longer than that is crazy. Now, the big factors in play are humidity, temperature, airflow, amount of liquid used, the initial moisture content of the wood, the number of layers, thickness of layers, and material types. All that being said, my 3 Sinew layers took a day apiece at 75 degrees Fahrenheit and 14% relative humidity. Now given, this means my wood is near 0% moisture content, which is pushing to the extreme even with Hickory. However, I rehumidified the air, bringing my bow back to a safe level within 3 more days. And with the temperature roughly at 74 degrees Fahrenheit and the air at 46% relative humidity, a moisture content check shows the bow to be at almost 8%. For most woods, the general rule of thumb is 9 to 12%. Go higher and the limbs take too much set and become sluggish. Lower can give you less set and a faster bow, but the wood type must be tough enough to take the extra strain. This is of slightly less concern with Hickory, especially when it's backed. Now I'll continue on tillering as I was before. This is just a matter of consistently checking your work. The less experienced you are, the more attentive you need to be. Even for someone who has made a handful of bows, oversights are terribly easy to make, as I'll prove here shortly. I'm ditching the tillering string and bracing the bow with a proper one for the first time. The video on making that string will follow this one, and I'll link it here and in the description down below. I'm about to realize my grievous mistake here shortly. Remember that split from earlier? Well, I think that just reared its ugly head with some help from my decorative tips. But when you screwed up as much stuff as I have, you get pretty good at fixing things. First step, square these up. Then prep for sinew. Glue up the split and clamp it. The rest is just like backing the bow, but we're reinforcing the shoulders and wrapping all the way around. And I can pretty much guarantee you I will never see that issue on this bow again. And now I know to address these kind of things earlier on in the future. Just a touch more removal to true the tiller up. For comparison on weight, here's my previous bow, which pulls about 65 pounds at 25 inches. Both bows are 50 inches tip to tip, and I braced them at 6 inches. My new bow comes in at around 60 pounds at the same draw. They're pretty close considering this was the first time I even checked the weight. So now I'll scrape and sand out some tool marks before I move on to finishing. It's also not a bad idea to shoot your bow in for 100 shots or so. That way if the stresses cause your tiller to change, you can easily fix it. I like to tidy things up a bit by scraping away excess glue and trimming loose sinew. And then final sanding is with 220 grit paper. This hole, which is made by a wood wasp larva, isn't detrimental to the bow, so I'll simply fill it with glue and sawdust. You can see it goes from the belly and out the side of the bow. Or take my word for it, since my focus wasn't very good there. I'll be adding a buckskin handle wrap, which significantly quiets the arrow's contact with the bow, and it's a nice finishing touch. I'm cutting it from a small piece, which means working in a circle around the outside of the skin. To find my length, I mock up the wrap, and then I trim it at the appropriate spot. If you have to cut around any tight corners like this, I'll show you how to straighten that up. First, you want to trim off the excess on the outside of the corner. Then stretch the leather a bit. This should significantly improve its straightness, but if necessary, you can come back in and trim a little bit more. I'll be working with pine pitch to glue this up. which means I need some heat. Hey look, there's my OCD. I'm going to mark lines to stay inside of with my glue. Then I'll remove the wrap and spread glue on the belly, sides, and back. I apply it pretty liberally, but to avoid squeeze out, go a little bit less than I did here. To bring the glue back to working temperature, I'll use a heat gun. Then it's just a matter of putting the wrap in place. You can see the squeeze out I was talking about. You're best off letting it cool completely before removing it. That way you don't make a bigger mess. On each end, you can just cut an angle and then tuck it back under the wrap. If you gently reheat the whole wrap, you can get it molded just like you want it. If you've seen my previous bow video, you'll probably recognize this. I'm applying it a bit differently, but using the same black and mahogany leather dyes. And if you're wondering, those are wood skewers. They're just fancy sticks. Now I'm watering down some of the mahogany dye and applying it over my initial designs. Here I've soaked a rag in alcohol and then coated it in charcoal dust, and I'm rubbing it into the finish. I'll follow that by sanding the high points of the sinew to add contrast. And then finally clean it all up with alcohol. Last and probably least, this is a finish I make of 50-50 beeswax and tallow with just a bit of pine pitch melted in. Thanks a lot for joining me today, guys. I'd really be honored if you'd subscribe to my channel, but even more if you leave me comments or questions down below. I'll see you all in the next one.